Obviously, that's a sort of fun, sexy new company. But I think the bigger story here is this, clear push to regulate SPACs.
This is Tom Fox. That was Professor Karen Woody, who joins me for this special episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, where we take up the enforcement actions in late 2021 on JPMorgan for electronic document retention and Nikola for imprudent tweets and other social media outreach from its former CEO, Trevor Milton. We take a deep dive into both enforcement actions, and Karen uses it to comment on the regulatory atmosphere around SPACs at this point in time. I know you will enjoy it. And I wanted to start with JPMorgan because they were embroiled in a enforcement action involving both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the CFTC for failures in electronic record keeping. And this was not a one-off failure. This was a $200 million total fines and penalties failure. And I found this a very interesting case, particularly from the SEC perspective. Neither the SEC order or the CFTC order really went into a lot of detail that we typically see, but it was pretty clear to me that, at least from the SEC's perspective, they were very upset with JPMorgan. And they were upset because they had policies and procedures which were not followed. They had supervisors who were in charge of training their employees and then overseeing them and monitoring on these procedures and policies and procedures, and the supervisors were some of the most recalcitrants. And by electronic record keeping, it was, I probably should have specified, it was in the trading function where by federal mandate, they have to record transactions. For those who may think this is a new requirement, it's not. I can remember doing arbitrations involving trading cases in the 90s, and they actually physically recorded all calls. And that was a fabulous record. If you had any sort of dispute thereafter, we've gotten a little more sophisticated, and you don't have cassette recordings anymore, but those same rules and regs existed. And there was a complete, total, and utter failure by the compliance function who was charged with overseeing this, and the actual implementation went down to the front line to these supervisors. The supervisors used WhatsApp and Slack, Zoom, and other ephemeral messaging strategies to have literally thousands of text messages that were not available. Unfortunately for JPMorgan, they seemed to be unaware this was going on, to the point where the issue arose for JPMorgan, when the SEC was investigating some counterparties on trades. The counterparties produced the text messaging. The SEC went to JPMorgan and said, why haven't you told us about this? And then they laid a subpoena on them, and JPMorgan didn't respond to the subpoena. One way to piss off the regulators. Then when the SEC came back and said, no, we really meant it, produce all of this, JPMorgan did a deeper dive and found out, well, maybe we do have some records, which once again is not good in the eyes of the regulators. So a massive fine and penalty, by far the largest for the failure. And the thing that struck me, Karen, was that there was no illegal behavior, or uncovered rather, that came up because of this. It was simply this failure to engage in mandated electronic record keeping. So I thought a lot of lessons for the compliance professional that perhaps we can talk about. But you were also intrigued with the Nikola fine. And I wanted to hear your take on that.
Sure. Well, as I'm assuming many of your listeners are aware, Nikola, I guess it's not even electronic. It's a company that ostensibly makes hydrogen-powered trucks, or plans to, is in the works of making those trucks and vehicles on hydrogen power. Just this week, they settled with the SEC for $125 million to settle a number of allegations about the failure of the company to prevent its then CEO, Trevor Milton, from making a number of allegedly false statements about the products and about the company and about whether they work or not. And so famously, there's a video that is posted where they think the truck is moving on its own power, but it turns out it's actually just rolling down a hill, and then they altered the video to make it look like it was operating in its own power. They shifted the video frame so it looked like it was going straight instead of downhill. So those things, again, like your story, don't look great, and the regulators are not very happy about it. What's most fascinating about this case is the fact that Nikola went public via SPAC. And so the timeline here, I think, is very interesting, and I would argue maybe somewhat problematic in terms of the enforcement ability of the SEC, in the sense that Nikola merged with a company called Vetco IQ, and that merger occurred in March, I believe, of 2020. Vetco IQ, again, via SPAC, went public in May 2018 via IPO. It then had, at that point, 24 months to find a partner to do sort of the marriage of the SPAC. And they managed to do that just right down to the wire, only a few months before that 24-month window expired. And they obviously merged with Nikola, at which point they then de-SPACed, and that is how Nikola is trading. The reason I think it's interesting is that a number of these statements and propaganda that Trevor Milton was making via tweets and via podcasts, a lot of that happened prior to the de-SPACing point, meaning Nikola isn't at that point itself a publicly traded company. And so more than just sort of this, interesting, fraudulent seeming activity by, a hot company that, there's no irony that it's called Nikola because it's supposed to be sort of a cousin to Tesla in some ways, although those companies are not related. Obviously, that's a sort of fun, sexy new company. But I think the bigger story here is this, clear push to regulate SPACs, given the fact that some people might argue that SPACs are kind of a Trojan horse around an IPO, and these regulations about conditioning the market and all the sort of standard IPO regulations that are in existence. SPAC mergers and the way that companies go public via SPAC is in some ways an end around some of those regulations. And here we have the SEC going after statements and propaganda and things that look like it's very much conditioning the market, things that wouldn't be allowed if this company had gone public via IPO. So I think this story really is more about the SPAC structure, this idea that the SEC very much wants to push back or at least get additional eyes on and regulation around companies that go public in this manner. And so, obviously, Trevor Milton is indicted and is still in the midst of fighting his own individual charges on this. All of that will still play out through next year, but the company has settled in a no admit, no deny. The angle on the company, though, like the JPMorgan story, is very much one that is important for all compliance officers, because the issue with the company really was this inability to rein in the CEO from saying certain things that the company, I think, knew could be certainly very problematic. And so the lesson for compliance officers is certainly to make sure that there is some ability to check what is being said by these sort of rock star CEOs as they are out trying to raise money for the companies, or even just describing the new technology that they're bringing to market. So, like I say, two things: a major lesson for compliance officers and compliance professionals, but also a bigger lesson, I think, for SPACs and how SPACs need to be very careful about who they are merging with, and then maybe the baggage that comes when you are merging with new companies in that way.
Karen, I thought there was lots of lessons learned, and let me just continue your thoughts on SPACs, because the SEC obviously is troubled by SPACs. They're troubled by their inability to regulate anything up until the time of the de-SPACing when the acquired company goes public. Do you think the SEC might use this as a way to leverage perhaps more control in the pre-acquisition period or something like that?
I think so. And we've seen a little of that before with the SEC, even stepping in before a de-SPACing point to say the due diligence wasn't sufficient. I think Gensler very much has this on his radar, and the SEC more broadly does, to ensure, again, they have a real worry that this type of structure is problematic to investors, and they think in their mission to protect investors, really looking at what investors are aware of, the amount of disclosure they've seen, both in the merger and then in the de-SPACing points. All of that really is going to be closely scrutinized by the regulators, because I think they are concerned that SPACs are, a shortcut to the market and are an end around some of, again, the very robust structure that is required to go public via IPO. But if you're at the SEC, you would argue that is because it's to protect investors. They know what they're buying. They know what they're getting into. And there's not as much of that protection when you're dealing with SPACs.
Karen, if this case sounds somewhat familiar or suspiciously familiar, we might think about Elon Musk, who famously gave a tweet of, I think it was $420 a share to take Tesla private. That didn't happen. Eventually, that did not happen. He got into hot water with the SEC, and the SEC fined him $20 million. There's a huge leap from $20 million to $175 million. So I was intrigued to maybe ask you, really the difference in those fines and penalties. Is it partly not only the quality or lack thereof of Mr. Milton's tweets, but the ubiquitousness of them, as opposed to Musk with just one or a few tweets, and then the remedy put in place that you already hit on, which is somebody has to oversee and review these? Did that really come out of what we saw the SEC say or do to Elon Musk? We'll be right back with our continued exploration of JPMorgan and Nikola after this message.
Sure. I mean, Elon is always in the headlines and has always had somewhat of a target on his back, and some of that is justified based on his behavior, as we all know, in some ways. I think, again, I would harken back to what I think is the major takeaway from the Nikola case, is that it is the SPAC. I think it's really looking more closely and scrutinizing more closely companies that don't have, like Tesla, sort of years of documentation, years of public filings. And so I think that is the shot across the bow that might explain some of the tighter screws on this particular enforcement action. And then I think with Elon, the tweets weren't entirely about the product. I mean, it's him sort of spouting off, at that point even making a joke that he later claimed had to do with marijuana culture and 420. I mean, he's sort of a bit of a just joker, whereas I think Milton really was pumping up the market for people considering investing in his company. So I think the timeline of those two individuals and when they're making those statements really factors into the risk that the SEC sees when those statements are made.
The other thing that intrigued me, and particularly around your thoughts on Elon Musk and his fine and penalty, was we're all looking towards the jury to make a decision in the Elizabeth Holmes case, and we saw lots of testimony about claims she allegedly made during her CEO-ship of Theranos, and now we see Trevor Milton and how he tried to sell Nikola, certainly prior to going public and even after de-SPACing it and going public. And it really pointed to me the difference in mentality and approaches from companies trying to raise money privately, i.e. not in the public markets, and those that are in the public market. How is, let me see if I can ask the question correctly. How does a CEO make that shift from cheerleader and raiser of funds to CEO of a public company with lots more obligations? Is it such a high failure rate that you really need to bring in a new leadership team after you go public? Can someone who really is a visionary, or at least believe they're a visionary and wants to sell that vision, even if they have to fake it till they make it, is that person capable of doing the things necessary to run a public company? And how do you evaluate that in due diligence?
That's a great question. And I mean, even just the sort of behavioral, psychology of that is that you can't imagine some of these sort of rock star CEOs that come up with these ideas and raise money privately, stepping aside once, they can finally launch the company. I mean, that is a big ask of, I think, anyone, honestly. But I do think that this idea of being cheerleader, raising funds, doing it privately, and then shifting to recognizing the very strict, as I said, sort of robust structure around what can be said and what can't be said when your company then is going public and getting investors from anywhere. That distinction, I think, really is the cornerstone of a lot of securities laws. And so there should be, again, a lot of due diligence. I hope a lot of attorneys and compliance professionals involved in that very important shift from going from private to public. And so it's not new, I don't think. I think we've seen a lot of people recently, sort of have a lot of foot faults on that. But I think you're pointing out exactly one of the issues, which is it's hard to step away. It's hard to shift gears and to, actually enter into what is sort of seen as the quiet period before going public and those type of things. That's a tricky place to be. And so I think the board really needs to step up, and the compliance professionals need to make clear what is allowed and what is not allowed, because it's a tricky shift that I think a lot of CEOs aren't maybe fully aware of.
Now let me shift back to JPMorgan. And the first thing I wanted to ask you is, I know you've sat across from the SEC in negotiations when you were in private practice, and I've talked to a lot of white-collar practitioners, both former DOJers and those who've not been in the government. And to a man or a woman, they all say the most important thing when you sit across from the regulators is your credibility. Because if you self-report, usually the first or second question is, do you have the documents tied down? And you have to be able to answer that accurately, and because if you don't, and you don't have them tied down, and you represent you do have them tied down, it's going to hurt your credibility throughout that investigation, and it may hurt your credibility professionally down the line as well. So when I saw that the SEC, one, had to go to JPMorgan, not once but twice, and then read some of the language in the order, it seemed to me that that credibility was lacking for JPMorgan, and that the SEC really penalized Morgan because they, one, misrepresented intentionally or not, or unintentionally, I should say, and then they couldn't still answer the SEC when the SEC had the evidence in form of the counterparty's documentation of electronic record keeping. So I really wanted to start with asking you, from your perspective, is that credibility as critical with the SEC as it is with the DOJ or other regulators?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of these negotiations are built on trust. It's a lot of the reason why some of the big partners at all of these, large DC, New York firms are former regulators, because, the pitch even for them to get some of the cases is, I know these people, I used to work there, there's a trust already existing, so we'll be able to go in and really negotiate because we're already coming from an existing relationship. I mean, some people call that the revolving door of Washington, but I do think there's some purpose to it, which is exactly that, this idea that I trust this person, I used to work with them, and so it's easy for me to figure out how to start these negotiations from a place where we can both walk away feeling like we have achieved something that we want out of it. And so this idea that, especially the things like that the SEC discovered some of this by virtue of doing other and looking into other companies and then learning this about JPMorgan, all of the facts around this particular story suggests that the SEC is fed up and that JPMorgan very much breach that trust if there was any. So I think you're really you're on your back foot if you're JPMorgan and not going in again, sort of acknowledging what you did or self-reporting or setting up some understanding that you're willing to comply with the regulators. It's not a good look for JPMorgan. You're right.
There was also a requirement in the JPMorgan SEC cease and desist order for what they called a, quote, compliance consultant, end quote, to oversee JPMorgan's execution of its obligations under the order and building out its compliance program around electronic record keeping. I have to say, I can't even say compliance consultant because that to me was exactly what a monitor does. But I wanted to ask you a couple of things, whatever moniker you might want to put on it. I suppose oversight would be a fair moniker. But it went into an incredible level of detail down to the compliance consultant had to report on not only the discipline rendered on employees who violated the electronic record keeping, but also whether that discipline was consistent throughout the organization, meaning from senior managers all the way down to the frontline traders. Is that something you typically would see in an SEC order? And if not, why would you think the SEC would go to that level of detail?
I think you're right, and I see maybe the trajectory of your question suggests that I think this is a little bit not in keeping with how typically these settlements may go. I think the detail goes back to what you were saying before about how miffed the SEC was, how much they don't trust JPMorgan. Again, they had existing policies that they had flouted. So it's not an issue of the SEC saying, okay, well, now you got some policies, let's make sure you're following them. They already had not been following them. And so we're already starting from a place where the SEC is not trusting the company. I also, with you, I raised my eyebrows also at the compliance consultant because I thought, isn't this just a monitor? Or maybe we're just using a new term now. So I think that they're really going to lean heavily on that person and make clear to JPMorgan that this is not something they're going to take lightly or that they're going to let this sort of fall by the wayside. I think they'll be continually checking in with that person to make sure that they're keeping to what they said they would do.
This is Tom Fox again. I would urge you to check out Karen Woody's new podcast on the Compliance Podcast Network, where with students from her insider trading class, she explores the history of insider trading. It's a unique format for a podcast with Karen interviewing her students, but her students are great, very knowledgeable, and I know you will enjoy it. Once again, it's Classroom Insider, and it appears on the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope you will join us again next week for another episode of the FCPA Compliance Report, which is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.